Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. It was mid-January in Traverse City, Michigan, and the kind of cold that made the air feel heavy. Every morning, the neighborhood was covered in a new layer of snow, thick, silent, and endless. The kind of winter that made you check your windows twice before bed, not out of fear, but because you knew by morning they'd be frosted over again. The streets were quiet that time of year. Most people worked from home or stayed inside. The only real movement in the mornings came from Carl, my next-door neighbor. Carl was one of those older men who seemed built for winter. Thin but tough, always layered in flannel and denim, with a snow shovel that looked older than both of us combined. He was out there every morning before sunrise, like clockwork. You'd hear the scrape of his shovel before you saw him. It was almost comforting in a strange way, hearing that rhythmic push and scrape while you made coffee. It meant things were normal. He'd start at the top of his driveway and work his way down, neat rows, never missing a spot. By the time the rest of us woke up, his driveway was already clean. The snow piled perfectly along the edges. Sometimes I'd see him stop, lean on the handle, and just look down the street like he was thinking about something. Then he'd get back to work. I didn't talk to him much, but we'd wave now and then. His house was one of those old ranch-style homes. Single-story, faded green siding, big front window with lace curtains. His wife had passed years earlier, and his son only visited occasionally. Carl mostly kept to himself, but he wasn't a bad neighbor. He was reliable, quiet, respectful, the kind of man who'd lived in that house his entire adult life, and probably planned to die there too. It was around the middle of the month when I started noticing something strange. I'd been having trouble sleeping lately. Maybe it was the cold, or just the heaviness of winter, but I'd find myself awake at odd hours, sitting in the dark living room with the curtains cracked open. One night, I looked outside and saw Carl shoveling. That wouldn't have been strange, except it was 3:45 in the morning. The street was pitch black, no streetlights, no headlights, no noise, just that faint figure moving back and forth under the dull reflection of the snow. He didn't have a light with him, no porch light, nothing. Just that steady movement, shovel scraping against the concrete. I watched for a while. He wasn't clearing his whole driveway, just one section of it, maybe 5 feet wide near the middle. He'd push the snow forward, then back over and over again. The same motion again and again, like he was stuck in a loop. After a few minutes, I told myself it wasn't my business. Maybe he couldn't sleep either. Maybe he was just trying to keep busy. The next morning, when I went outside, I looked across the street. His driveway was spotless, except for that same patch he'd been working on. It was scraped down to the bare concrete, cleaner than the rest, like he'd gone over it dozens of times. A couple of days went by. Then I saw him again. Same time, just before 4 a.m., same patch of driveway. No lights, no sound, just the scrape of that shovel. This time I noticed his movements were slower, almost mechanical. There was no pause, no rest. Just back and forth, back and forth. The snow kept falling that week, heavy and wet. Every morning I'd check his driveway, and it was always the same. One section perfectly cleared, the rest untouched. I mentioned it to my wife the next evening, just offhand while we were making dinner. She looked up from the stove and frowned like she was trying to place a memory. Then she said quietly, "That's not possible." I asked her what she meant. She hesitated, then said, "Carl passed away. I saw his son a few days ago. He said the funeral was last week." I didn't believe her at first. I thought maybe she'd misunderstood. But the next day, I saw Carl's son's truck parked out front. He was cleaning out the garage, loading boxes into the bed. I went out to check the mail and asked if he needed a hand. He looked exhausted. I told him I'd seen his dad out shoveling the other morning, and the look he gave me froze me in place. He said his dad had died in his sleep 2 weeks ago. Heart failure. The house had been empty ever since. After that, I stopped looking outside at night. I didn't want to see anything I couldn't explain, but it was impossible to ignore. Every few nights around the same time, 3:40, 3:45, I'd wake up without knowing why. And even if I didn't look, I could hear it faintly through the snow and the glass, that scraping sound. Slow, steady, metallic. Once I forced myself to look. The street was empty, covered in snow except for that one section of Carl's driveway. The same 5-foot strip scraped perfectly clean, shining under the porch light his son must have left on a timer. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe someone else was shoveling. Maybe the wind was blowing the snow differently there. But the pattern didn't make sense. There were no footprints, no tire tracks, no marks at all leading to that spot. Just that clean patch and everything else untouched. After a few weeks, the sun stopped coming by. The snow built up around the house. The porch steps disappeared under it. The curtains stayed closed. But that one section of driveway kept clearing itself, perfectly neat every few nights. It started to bother me more than it should have. Not because I believed in ghosts or anything like that, I didn't, but because it didn't make sense. I even walked over one afternoon to take a look. The snow was deep around it, knee-high in some places, but that patch was smooth concrete, dry and exposed to the air. When I crouched down, I noticed faint scratches on the surface, thin, curved lines overlapping in strange directions, like something heavy had been dragged across it again and again. I told myself it was ice melt, or temperature changes causing it to stay clear. Maybe the concrete was uneven, or maybe heat from underground pipes melted it faster, but no other driveway on the street had anything like it. By February, people started talking. Someone said they'd seen movement in the yard early in the morning, just a shadow crossing behind the mailbox. Someone else swore they saw lights flicker inside the house one night, even though the power was shut off. I didn't see any of that, but I did keep hearing the shovel. One night I decided to stay up and watch, to finally understand what was going on. I turned off all the lights in my living room and sat by the window. The snow was falling lightly, windless, quiet. The street looked dead, no movement anywhere. At exactly 3:44 a.m., the motion light over Carl's garage flicked on for a few seconds, then went dark again. I stared at that patch of driveway, waiting. The air felt heavier than before, like the cold itself was pressing against the glass. For a long time, nothing happened, just snow falling into more snow. I was about to give up when I noticed something strange. The snow around that section began to sink slightly, like something was brushing it away. The powder shifted, subtle, almost invisible, but the clean concrete started showing again in that same perfect rectangle. I couldn't see anyone there. No figure, no shovel, no movement. Just snow sliding aside, line by line, until it was bare again. When it was done, the air seemed stiller, like the sound had been taken out of everything. I waited another 10 minutes, but nothing else happened. Eventually, I went back to bed, though I barely slept. The next morning, I walked out to get the paper. The driveway looked the same, one spotless patch, everything else buried. I went over to it, touched the surface. It was dry, colder than ice, but solid, as if the snow couldn't touch it anymore. By March, the shoveling stopped. The snow melted, the grass returned, and Carl's house stayed empty until it was finally sold that summer. The new owners repaved the driveway completely. Fresh concrete, no marks, no uneven patches. That winter, when the snow came again, I waited to see if anything would happen. The storms came heavier than the year before, but the new driveway stayed covered like everyone else's. No clear spot, no sound in the night. Sometimes I think about that patch, the one Carl had worked on every morning for years, even after he was gone. Maybe it wasn't anything supernatural. Maybe it was just some trick of heat or timing. But I remember those scratches in the concrete and the way the snow seemed to move on its own. Whatever it was, it's gone now. But every winter, when I wake up in the dark and hear the wind pushing snow against the house, I still half expect to hear it again, that steady scrape of a shovel, back and forth, somewhere just outside my window. When I moved into my first apartment, I was 24, fresh out of college, and desperate for a place that didn't eat my entire paycheck. The building wasn't much, a 2-story brick complex just off the main road, with faded green railings and thin walls that made every sound someone else's problem. My unit was upstairs, number 204, facing the parking lot. Across the narrow hall was 205. The guy who lived there introduced himself the first day I moved in. He was maybe in his late 20s, tall, with a short beard, and that kind of friendly but awkward energy people have when they don't talk to many others. He said his name was Jeremy. I remember him offering to help carry boxes, but I told him I was fine. We talked briefly about where I worked, about how he'd been in the building for a while, how quiet it usually was. I remember thinking it was nice having a neighbor who at least seemed normal. For the first few weeks, I'd see him regularly. He'd be unlocking his door when I came home from work, or walking down the hall with his earbuds in. Sometimes I'd hear faint music through the wall when I was lying in bed, the kind of muffled sound you barely notice unless the apartment is completely silent. Every time we crossed paths, he'd smile, say hi, ask about my day. He seemed harmless, maybe a little lonely. We never hung out, but it was comforting to know there was someone across the hall who felt familiar. Then, after a few weeks, I stopped seeing him. No more casual greetings in the hallway, no more faint music through the wall. At first I figured he'd gone on vacation or maybe just kept different hours than me. But then late at night I started hearing something. Footsteps. Slow, heavy ones. They'd move back and forth across the floor of his apartment. I could hear the boards creak through the wall, rhythmic and deliberate like someone pacing. I'd be lying on the couch, half asleep, and it would start. The same pattern every time, back and forth. It wasn't constant, but often enough to make me aware of it. I told myself it was normal. Maybe he worked nights and had trouble sleeping during the day. Maybe he was stressed. Everyone's got their quirks. But it kept happening. Sometimes around midnight, sometimes at 3 or 4 in the morning. It didn't sound like random movement. It was measured, steady, almost obsessive. Sometimes it would go on for 20 minutes straight, stop suddenly, and then start again. One weekend afternoon, I saw the maintenance guy, an older man named Carl, fixing a light near the stairwell. I mentioned that the guy across from me had been pretty noisy at night. Carl paused, wiping his hands on a rag, and looked at me. "Across from you? 205?" he asked. I nodded. He frowned. "Nobody's in 205 right now. Hasn't been for a while." I thought he was joking at first, but he wasn't. He said the last tenant left months ago and the unit had been empty ever since. I remember feeling this cold heaviness in my chest. I told him that wasn't possible. I'd seen the guy, talked to him, heard him moving around. Carl looked confused but said we could go check. We went upstairs and he pulled out his keys. When he tried the lock, the door wouldn't open all the way. It was chained from the inside. He knocked once, then again, calling out a cautious maintenance. Nothing. The hallway smelled faintly stale, like dust and damp carpet. I could feel my heart beating hard in my throat. Carl unclipped a small crowbar from his tool bag and pried at the frame. When the chain finally gave way and the door creaked open, a wave of air rolled out. Thick, musty, rotten. It was the kind of smell that makes your stomach tighten instantly, like something that had been closed up too long. The blinds were half drawn, letting in gray light. The place was mostly empty. No furniture except a stained mattress in the middle of the living room floor. There was a pile of mail stacked near the door, envelopes yellowed and curled from humidity. Carl picked a few up and flipped through them. Eviction notices, utility shut-off warnings, all dated 6 months earlier. Dust covered the counters, the windowsills, even the floor near the corners. No sign of anyone living there recently. We checked the bathroom and the small kitchen. Nothing, no clothes, no dishes, no toothbrush. Just that mattress and a few crushed cans on the floor. The air felt heavy, like the whole place had been holding its breath for too long. I remember standing in the middle of the room, looking around, trying to make sense of what I had seen and heard. I could still picture Jeremy's face clearly. I'd spoken to him multiple times, He'd stood right there in the hallway, smiling, holding his keys. After that day, the pacing stopped. For the first time in weeks, the apartment across the hall was completely silent. At night, the quiet felt strange, almost unnatural, like the building itself was missing a familiar sound. I started wondering if I'd somehow imagined it, if maybe the footsteps had come from another unit, or from someone walking in the hallway and echoing through the thin walls. But it hadn't sounded distant. It had come from directly across from me. A few days later, I saw Carl again and asked what they planned to do with the apartment. He said they'd clean it out and maybe repaint before renting it again. I didn't ask more. I didn't want to. But that smell, that musty, rotten odor, it lingered in my mind. It wasn't just dust. It had that organic, sickly edge, like something that had decayed and been shut away. Weeks went by. New tenants moved into other units, people came and went, but 205 stayed empty. The blinds were always drawn, and no one touched the pile of old mail that still sat inside the door. Every time I passed it, I'd feel this uneasy pressure in my chest, like the air around that doorway was thicker than everywhere else. One night, around 2 in the morning, I woke up to use the bathroom. The building was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. As I stepped into the hallway, I froze. Through the still air, I heard it, faint, muffled right through the wall. Footsteps, slow, steady, heel-toe. Hail-to. The same rhythm I'd heard before. It sounded exactly the same. My scalp prickled and my throat went dry. I stood there for what felt like a full minute, barely breathing, listening. The sound was so faint it almost blended with the ticking of the wall clock. Then it stopped. The silence that followed was so deep it made my ears ring. The next morning, I told myself it had to be my imagination, that maybe someone downstairs had been walking around and the sound carried up through the structure. But when I stepped outside to leave for work, I glanced at the door across the hall. The thin layer of dust on the doorknob was undisturbed. The little cobweb that had formed in the corner of the door frame was still there. Nothing had moved. After that, I avoided looking at that door at night. Sometimes walking up the stairs after work, I'd slow down just before passing it, listening for anything. A creak, a shift, the faint sound of footsteps. Most nights there was nothing. But every once in a while, when the building was still and the air felt too heavy to breathe, I'd swear I could hear it again. That slow, measured pacing coming from the other side of the wall. I never reported it again. I didn't even tell Carl. Eventually, someone new rented 205, a woman in her 30s with a dog. She moved in a few months later, and the first night I heard her walking around, unpacking boxes, talking to someone on the phone. Normal sounds, real living sounds. But even then, beneath it all, I sometimes thought I could hear another rhythm layered under hers. Faint, distant, almost hidden. Hail to. Heel too. I still live in that building. It's been 2 years now. The new tenant moved out last month and 205 is empty again. The blinds are drawn, the mail is starting to collect, and the air in the hallway smells faintly like dust again. At night when I come home from work, I try not to glance at that door. I tell myself it's just an old building. That sounds travel weird. That memory can play tricks. But every time I pass it, I can feel the faint vibration through the floorboards, like the echo of someone walking just beyond the wall, retracing the same narrow path they always have, step after step as if they never really left. I'd lived in that apartment for almost a year before anything strange ever happened. It was a quiet, aging building on the east side of town, the kind of place where everyone mostly kept to themselves. The walls were thin, but after a while you learned to tune things out. You could hear snippets of TV shows, plumbing, footsteps, that sort of thing. My place was on the second floor. 1 bedroom, cheap rent, old carpet. The wall I shared was with an older woman named Mrs. Holloway. I'd seen her maybe a dozen times in passing. Short, gray-haired, always wore house slippers outside, carried one of those floral cloth shopping bags. She had a gentle face, kind of tired-looking but pleasant. She mostly stayed inside. Her curtains were always drawn, except when she opened them for sunlight in the morning. I used to hear her TV every night around 7. Same low-volume chatter of game shows or old movies. Sometimes she coughed a lot. The sound of her voice had sort of blended into the background of my life, comforting in a strange way, because it reminded me someone else was there. The kind of comfort that comes from the presence of another human being, even one you never really speak to. Then, one morning, I heard something that wasn't normal. It was early, around 6:30. I'd just made coffee and was sitting at my small kitchen table scrolling through emails when I noticed this faint sound through the wall. It took me a second to realize what it was. Crying, not loud but steady. Soft, broken sobs. I thought maybe she was watching a sad movie, but it kept going. I listened for words, but there weren't any. Just crying that sounded tired, like she'd been doing it for a long time. I stood near the wall, listening. It went on for minutes. I knocked gently once, just in case she needed something. No answer. I waited, knocked again. Nothing. I tried to shrug it off, telling myself maybe she just wanted privacy. Still, it bothered me. There was something raw in that sound. Not the kind of crying people do when they're watching a movie. More like real grief. I left for work that morning with it still in my head. When I came home that night, her TV was on again, muffled through the wall. Everything seemed normal. I told myself maybe I'd imagined how bad it sounded. The next day, the crying came back. This time at night, around 11 when the building had gone mostly quiet. I was lying on the couch half asleep when I heard it again through the thin wall. The same low, fragile sobbing. It came in waves, quiet, then louder, then quiet again. But this time I also heard something else. A faint whispering. Not words I could make out, just low murmurs, like someone talking through a blanket. At first I thought maybe she had someone over, but the tone of it didn't sound like a conversation. It sounded one-sided, like she was talking to herself, or to someone who wasn't responding. I remember sitting there in the dark, just listening. The longer I listened, the more unsettled I felt. I turned off the TV to hear better, and the whispering went on for maybe 20 minutes before it stopped. Then nothing. Silence. The next morning, I ran into one of my neighbors by the mailboxes, a middle-aged guy named Daniel who lived down the hall. I mentioned that I thought Mrs. Holloway might be having a hard time. He shrugged and said she'd lived there for years, alone since her husband died, and sometimes people like that get lonely. I let it go, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. That night, it started again. Same time, right around 11. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it. Quiet sobbing, pressed close to the wall like she was sitting right up against it. I turned off the bathroom light and just stood there, toothbrush in hand, listening. Then came the whispering again, a little louder this time. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but it had this pleading tone. A kind of desperate rhythm, like she was begging. The crying grew uneven, then stopped abruptly like someone had hit pause. I waited for a while, but there was nothing else after that. I told myself I'd check on her in the morning, but I didn't. I got caught up in work, and by the time I remembered, it was late. The next few days went the same way. Crying at night, whispering, then silence. Always starting around the same hour, always fading out after a while. On the fourth night, it got worse. The crying started earlier, maybe 10:30, and it sounded different. Hoarser. The sobs came in short gasps, like she couldn't breathe properly. The whispering was faster too, like panicked muttering. I could hear her moving this time. Something scraping, a thump like furniture shifting. That's when I decided I couldn't ignore it anymore. I went out into the hall barefoot and knocked on her door. The sound from inside didn't stop. I called her name lightly just to see if she'd answer. Nothing. I knocked again, harder. Still nothing. I stood there a while, unsure what to do, then went back to my apartment. The next morning, the building manager came by to check smoke detectors. I stopped him in the hallway and mentioned Mrs. Holloway. Told him I'd been hearing crying for days and I was worried. He frowned and said he hadn't seen her in a while either. He grabbed his spare keys and went with me to her door. He knocked a few times, calling her name. then unlocked it and stepped inside. It was quiet for a minute. Then he came back out, pale as chalk. He didn't say much, just told me to wait in my apartment and that he was calling the police. Later, I found out that Mrs. Holloway had been dead for at least 4 days. That detail hit me like a punch. 4 days, but I'd heard her crying last night. I'd heard her whispering. The paramedics and cops came, their radios crackling in the hall. They carried her out on a stretcher, zipped up in a black bag. I stood by my window and watched the flashing lights reflect off the glass, thinking about all those nights I'd sat in the dark, listening, wondering what exactly I'd been hearing. The coroner's van left around midnight. The building went quiet again, too quiet. I turned off my lights and lay down, trying to sleep. But I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I'd hear it in my head, the sound of her muffled sobs through the wall. Around 1 a.m., it started again. I sat up immediately, heart pounding. It was faint at first, then clearer. Soft, slow crying, coming from the same spot in the wall. I froze, straining to listen. My rational mind kept trying to explain it. Maybe the pipes. Maybe the sound carried from somewhere else. Maybe one of the other apartments. But it wasn't any of that. It was the exact same sound I'd heard before. I got up, pressed my ear to the wall. The crying went on for several minutes. Then a whispering started. Low, broken, almost rhythmic. The same pattern as before. I stayed up the whole night, lights on, just listening. By morning, it stopped again. When I went downstairs, the manager was already in the hallway talking to one of the maintenance guys. I asked if anyone had gone into Mrs. Holloway's apartment since last night. He said no, the place was locked, sealed until her family came. He looked exhausted. I wanted to tell him I'd heard it again, but I didn't. I could barely make sense of it myself. For the next few days, it happened every night at almost the exact same time. The same sobbing, the same whispering, always through that same thin wall. I stopped sleeping much. I'd sit in the dark with my TV muted listening. I thought about moving, but I couldn't afford to. I even recorded the sound once, but when I played it back the next day, there was nothing but static. Eventually, I convinced the manager to let me see her apartment before it was rented again. He agreed reluctantly. I followed him in, and the first thing I noticed was how small it felt. The smell of old carpet and dust hung in the air. Her TV was still in the corner, unplugged. A chair faced the wall, the same wall I shared. A small table sat beside it, with an empty cup and a stack of tissues. That's when I realized what I'd been hearing all those nights. The crying, the whispering. It had been recorded. The police must have missed it, or ignored it. But the sound had come from a small portable tape recorder sitting under the chair. It must have been running on repeat. The tape was old, worn out, but when the manager pressed play, we heard it. The soft crying, the whispering. Her voice. She'd been recording herself for who knows how long. Maybe to leave a message. Maybe because she was lonely. Maybe she just wanted to hear herself alive in that empty apartment. I moved out 2 weeks later. Even now, sometimes when everything's quiet at night and I'm trying to fall asleep, I swear I still hear it. The soft sound of someone crying through a wall that isn't there anymore. Not a ghost. Just the kind of sound that gets stuck in your head, like a memory that refuses to fade. My sister and I moved into the duplex in early September, just after we both finished college. It was a small place on the edge of town, tucked behind a narrow road lined with overgrown hedges and chain-link fences. The rent was cheap, which was the main reason we took it. The building was split in two, our side on the left and another tenant on the right. From the outside, both halves looked the same, but ours had a small porch and a patchy front lawn. The woman who lived next door kept her blinds shut all the time, even during the day. Her curtains were this pale yellow that had turned gray around the edges, and you could never tell if she was home or not. We only saw her a handful of times in the first month, once when we moved in. She was standing on her porch, smoking, just watching. She didn't wave or say anything, just stood there until we went inside. Another time, I saw her walking to her car early in the morning, holding a plastic grocery bag, wearing an oversized sweatshirt and slippers. Her car was an old white Honda with one taillight covered in red tape. She looked like someone who kept to herself, which didn't bother us. We weren't trying to make friends. We just needed somewhere cheap to stay while we figured out our next steps. The first strange thing we noticed was the smell. It started faint, kind of like a cat litter box that hadn't been cleaned. At first we thought maybe she had pets, but it got worse. Some days it was sharp and chemical, like ammonia or bleach. And other times it had a thick, sweet rot to it, like spoiled fruit or old meat. When the wind blew in the right direction, it came through our open kitchen window and made us gag. We figured maybe her plumbing was bad, or maybe she was hoarding garbage. The duplex was old and shared the same foundation, so smells traveled easily. I remember one night my sister was cooking pasta, and the smell came through again, stronger than ever. It was this mix of cleaning chemicals and decay that made your eyes water. We shut all the windows and lit candles, but it didn't help much. My sister mentioned we should call the landlord, but I told her to wait. I didn't want to start problems with a neighbor we barely knew. Maybe she was cleaning something, I said. Maybe she spilled something. It felt easier to ignore it than to deal with whatever was going on next door. A week later, I was taking out the trash when I noticed the small gate that divided our backyards was open. It had always been closed before, tied with a bit of old wire. I assumed the wind had done it, so I shut it again. Our yard wasn't much. A patch of grass, a shed that leaned slightly to one side, and a couple of trash bins against the fence. Hers looked nearly identical, except her grass was dead and patchy, and her trash bins were lined up in perfect order. I remember thinking she must be meticulous about some things and careless about others. That evening, around sunset, I was washing dishes when my sister came up behind me and told me to look outside. I leaned over the sink and peered through the kitchen window. The woman was in our yard, crouched by our trash cans. It was quiet except for the hum of insects and the distant sound of traffic. She had something in her hands, a small glass jar, and was holding it close to one of the bins. The way she moved was slow and deliberate, almost like she was inspecting something. Her head tilted slightly, her hair falling forward in greasy strands. I felt uneasy watching her, like I was intruding on something private. My sister whispered that I should go out there, but I didn't move. I just stood there, frozen, staring. Then she looked up, not just glanced. She looked directly at us through the window. Her face was pale, expressionless. Then she smiled, this slow, stretched-out kind of smile that didn't match her eyes. Her lips barely parted, and I remember the way she stood up, slow, unhurried, holding the jar at her side. She said something through the glass that we couldn't hear clearly, but her mouth moved distinctly enough for us to understand. You shouldn't leave pieces of yourself lying around. Neither of us said anything for a moment. My sister backed away from the window, and I just stared as she walked back through the gate to her side. I wanted to believe we misunderstood. Maybe she was talking to herself. Maybe we didn't hear right. But something about the way she said it, like it was meant for us, made my stomach twist. That night, neither of us slept well. We kept hearing small sounds outside. Rustling, faint clinks, maybe the gate creaking again. Every little noise made us jump. By morning, everything looked normal. The gate was closed again. Our trash bins untouched, the yard quiet. I went to work like nothing happened, but the image of her crouched there with that jar kept replaying in my head. 2 days later, my sister called me at work, her voice shaky. She said she'd gone behind the shed to get a broom we kept there and found something. I came home early and she was waiting inside, pale and anxious. She led me out to the back, to the narrow space between the fence and the shed. There, half buried under some leaves, was a glass jar. It was the same size as the one the woman had been holding. The lid was sealed, and the outside was smeared with a dark brown crust. Inside were what looked like clumps of hair. Long strands, some blonde, some darker, mixed with wadded tissues that looked like they came from our bathroom trash. There were faint streaks of dried reddish brown on the inside of the glass, like old blood. I felt sick. My first thought was that she must have been going through our garbage. Maybe she'd taken stuff from the bathroom trash, maybe from the hairbrushes. It was disgusting, but part of me tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was mentally unwell, maybe she was some kind of collector, maybe it wasn't personal. But it felt personal. The tissues had the same pattern as the ones we bought from the dollar store. The hair was our color, both of ours. We didn't touch it. I remember wrapping my hand in a towel, picking it up by the base and dropping it straight into a trash bag. I tied it shut, double-knotted it, and threw it in the bin outside. For the rest of that day, every sound made us jump. We locked all the doors and windows and stayed in the living room with the TV on, even though neither of us was really watching. That night, I heard something again. Around midnight, a faint sound at the back door, not knocking, just the sound of metal scraping softly, like something brushing against the lock. I didn't move. I sat up in bed listening, holding my breath. After maybe 10 seconds, it stopped. I got up, checked the door, and saw nothing. But the next morning, when I looked closer, there were small marks on the metal, like something sharp had scratched near the handle. We didn't talk much about it after that. There wasn't anything to say. We both knew we had to leave. I called the landlord and said we'd be moving out by the end of the week. We started packing that same day. During those last few days, we barely went outside. We didn't see her again, but we could hear her sometimes. Faint footsteps next door, or what sounded like glass clinking. On our last night, the smell came back, stronger than ever, and seeped through the wall like smoke. I remember sitting there, boxes stacked by the door, and just wanting morning to come. We left early the next day. As we loaded the car, I looked once toward her side of the duplex. Her blinds were still shut tight, and the curtains looked darker now, stained or maybe just shadowed. There was no sign of her, no sound. The gate between our yards hung open again, swaying slightly in the breeze. A few days after we moved, curiosity got the better of me. I looked up the address online, trying to see if anything had happened there after we left. There was nothing. No news, no police reports, nothing at all. It was like she'd never existed. The landlord didn't even mention her when I dropped off the keys. I still think about that jar sometimes. How careful she looked holding it, how deliberate. I wonder if she ever found where we moved. Sometimes when I take out the trash at night, I look over my shoulder before I go back inside, half expecting to see her standing there again, smiling that quiet, patient smile. We got away, but I don't think we were the first ones who found something like that in their yard. I moved into the studio apartment on the east side of Portland in early spring of 2019. It was a small, tired building that probably hadn't been renovated since the late 70s. The floors creaked like a bad conscience. The heater made a soft ticking noise whenever it turned off, and the smell of the hallway was a mix of old paint and someone's stale cooking. Still, it was cheap, and after my divorce, I didn't have the money or the energy to be picky. I just wanted somewhere quiet where I could start over, where no one knew my name or asked questions. The apartment faced a narrow courtyard, more of a gap than an actual yard, just wide enough for two people to stretch a clothesline between the facing buildings. My window looked directly into another apartment across the way, maybe 20 feet or so. When I first moved in, I tried not to look that direction much. It felt rude, like peering into someone else's life, but the window was right in front of my small table, and sometimes my eyes just wandered. The man who lived across the way seemed ordinary enough. Middle-aged, maybe late 40s. He had glasses, thinning hair, and always wore dark clothes. I'd sometimes catch sight of him sitting in an old armchair with a book, or walking past his window to what I assumed was a kitchen. Nothing strange about that. He never opened his curtains all the way, just enough that I could see a sliver of his living room. But after about a week, I noticed something odd. He never turned on any lights. I'd sit at my table late into the night, working on my laptop or just staring out at the rain, and I'd see him sitting there, motionless in that chair, with the faint orange glow of the streetlight spilling into his room. No lamp, no overhead light, just him sitting there barely visible. At first I thought maybe he liked the dark or was trying to save on electricity, but it was strange how still he always was. He never seemed to move for long stretches of time. Sometimes when I'd glance up quickly, I could swear he was looking straight at me, though I could never see his eyes clearly enough to tell. After a few days of that, I stopped looking. I kept the blinds mostly shut, but even then I felt the odd sense that I was being watched. It wasn't paranoia exactly. It was more like a low hum in the back of my head that wouldn't go away. Then, small things in my own apartment began to feel wrong. Not stolen or damaged, just shifted. The first thing I noticed was the bar of soap in the bathroom. I always kept it neatly centered on the edge of the sink. But one evening after work, I saw it pushed toward the back corner, as if someone had moved it with a wet hand. I shrugged it off, told myself I must have done it without remembering. A few days later, the fridge door was slightly open when I got home. Not wide, just enough for the light to glow faintly on the floor. I lived alone. I'd been gone all day. I told myself it must not have shut properly, but I started double-checking it before bed. Then it was the smell. A faint scent of something different in the apartment. Not bad, just off, like someone's cologne or deodorant I didn't use. The smell would come and go, usually when I got home from work, like the air had shifted while I was gone. I started locking the door twice, even though the deadbolt worked fine. I checked the windows too, making sure they were shut tight. It got to the point where I'd leave small things in certain places before leaving. A pen on the counter, a coaster on the floor, just so I'd know if someone had come in. Every day when I got back, I'd check them first. Most days they were untouched. But once or twice the coaster was tilted or the pen was missing, only to reappear the next day. I tried to tell myself I was imagining it, that it was just the stress or the loneliness after the divorce. My ex-wife used to say I was too in my head, and maybe she was right. Maybe I was just spooking myself. But the thing that made it worse was that window. Even when I didn't want to, I'd glance over at it at night. The man was always there, always sitting, always still, always in the dark. Once late one night, I thought I saw him stand up suddenly, but when I blinked, he was sitting again. I tried not to think about it. Then came that night. It was around 2:30 in the morning. I couldn't sleep. Just one of those nights when your mind won't quiet down. I'd been scrolling on my phone for too long, the glow of the screen making the room feel smaller. I set it down on the nightstand and looked toward the window. Across the courtyard, his apartment was dark. No movement, just the faint outline of furniture in the orange streetlight. Then I saw something in the reflection of my own window. Just the smallest flicker of movement. At first I thought it was outside. Maybe a branch swaying or a car passing by, but the movement wasn't from outside. It was inside. It was behind me. I didn't move at first. I just stared at the glass, at the faint outline of my own shoulders, my bed, the corner of the room. And then, in the reflection, I saw the closet door. It was open, just a few inches. I had closed it earlier. I always closed it. Something pale showed in the gap between the door and the frame. A hand. It wasn't moving, just resting there, fingers curled slightly like whoever it belonged to was waiting. My whole body went cold. I didn't turn around right away. My first thought was that it couldn't be real. Maybe it was some trick of light. Maybe my mind was making shapes out of the dark. But I could see the slight motion of the fingers, the subtle shift like someone flexing them slowly. I finally turned. The closet door was open wider now, just enough that the edge of a sleeve was visible. I didn't say anything. I just backed toward the front door step by step, not taking my eyes off the closet. My phone was on the nightstand. I didn't reach for it. I didn't want to make noise. When I got to the door, I twisted the lock and yanked it open. The hallway outside was dimly lit by the emergency light, the carpet worn and stained. I ran out barefoot, shut the door behind me, and went straight to the building's front entrance. I didn't stop until I was outside on the sidewalk. It was cold. The kind of Portland cold that seeps into your skin, I stood there breathing hard, staring up at my window. Nothing moved. The other window, the man's window, was dark. I called the police from the gas station down the street. 2 officers came and went through the apartment. They didn't find anyone. The closet was empty. The window latch in the kitchen had been broken. Old, rusted metal that could have been pried open easily from the outside. One of the officers said it was probably a vagrant or someone who got into the wrong building, but I knew better. The courtyard was fenced. The only way in was through the main door, which locked automatically. Someone had either been living in the building or had a key. I didn't sleep in that apartment again. I packed a suitcase that morning and stayed in a motel on 82nd for a few nights until I found a new place. A week later, I went back to get the rest of my things. The manager let me in. The apartment looked just as I'd left it, except for one thing. The window blinds were open, all the way up, and taped to the inside of the glass was a small, torn piece of paper. I couldn't make out the handwriting at first. It was faint, almost smudged, but when I got closer, I could read it. It just said, "You shouldn't have looked." I left without taking the rest of my stuff. I didn't even tell the manager. I just walked out, locked the door behind me, and didn't look back at the window across the courtyard. That building was demolished a year later. Sometimes I drive past the empty lot on my way to work, and I still catch myself glancing at where his window used to be. Even now, I can't help but wonder if he was ever really living there at all. When I was in college, my roommate and I rented a small single-story house just off campus, on a quiet street lined with older homes and big maple trees that turned the sidewalks orange in the fall. The rent was cheap, mostly because the place hadn't been updated since the 70s. Creaky floors, thin walls, and an oil heater that smelled faintly metallic when it kicked on. We didn't mind. It was better than the dorms and it gave us space. The house next door belonged to an older couple, maybe in their late 60s or early 70s. They introduced themselves once when we first moved in, Mr. and Mrs. Hanley. Both retired teachers, polite but distant. The kind of people who smiled without showing their teeth. Their house was a little bigger than ours, painted a pale blue that had faded almost to gray. The front yard was neat but bare. A single trimmed bush under the window, no flowers, no decorations. Even then, something about it felt sterile. Too still, too quiet. During those first few weeks, we'd occasionally see Mr. Hanley taking the trash out, or Mrs. Hanley standing on the porch, staring at the street with her arms folded. They never waved unless we did first. After that, they seemed to disappear. By mid-September, the days got shorter and we started noticing things about their house that didn't feel right. The blinds were always shut. The lights inside never seemed to change. Sometimes nothing but darkness. Sometimes one dim glow from a lamp in the back room that stayed on until morning. We figured they were just reclusive. Old people, maybe sick or private. I remember joking once that maybe they just didn't like college kids. My roommate laughed. But he said later he got a weird feeling walking past their place at night, like someone was watching through the slats in the blinds. I didn't think much about it until one night near the end of October. I was up late finishing a paper in the living room, headphones in, when I thought I heard something through the wall. A faint, sharp sound, like a shout. I paused the music and waited. At first there was nothing. Then it came again. Quick, panicked bursts, a high-pitched scream that cut off too fast, followed by a dull thump. It sounded like it came from next door. I froze, staring at the wall between our houses. It happened again. Short screams, broken, like someone trying to call for help but being silenced. I got up and went to the window facing their house. The entire place was pitch black. No porch light, no glow behind the curtains. Just darkness. My heart started pounding. I thought maybe Mrs. Hanley had fallen or they were being robbed. I grabbed my phone and ran to my roommate's door. He was already awake, sitting up in bed, pale. He'd heard it too. He called 911 while I kept looking out the window, trying to see movement in that black house. Nothing. The police showed up fast. 2 cars, lights flashing blue and red across the empty street. We stood outside in the cold while they knocked on the Hanleys' front door. No one answered. One of them tried the knob. It opened. They went in with flashlights drawn. For a long time there was silence. Then a radio crackled and one of the officers stepped back out. His face looked strange, tight, blank, like he was trying not to react. He told us we wouldn't have to worry about the Hanleys anymore, then asked us to stay inside. That was it. They taped the area off, stayed for hours, and left just before sunrise. The next morning, the street was blocked by unmarked cars. We didn't see any bodies, but a coroner's van pulled up around noon. Neighbors started coming out, whispering to each other on the sidewalks. I overheard someone say the Hanleys were dead. At first, I thought it meant they had just died that night, maybe a murder-suicide or something. But then one of the detectives went door to door, asking if anyone had seen them recently. When I said not for weeks, he just nodded, wrote something down, and moved on. By afternoon, the local news truck showed up. That's when we found out the truth. The couple had been dead for weeks, both found in the bedroom, badly decomposed. No signs of forced entry, but food in the fridge had gone rotten, dishes piled up in the sink. The police said it looked like they'd been dead since early October, nearly 3 weeks before we heard the screams. That part didn't make sense. If they were already dead, then who had been inside that house? The news report said someone had clearly been living there. There were signs of recent activity. Trash moved, curtains adjusted, footprints in the dust. The strange part was that there wasn't much damage, nothing stolen, nothing broken. Whoever it was had been staying there quietly, eating canned food, using the water, sleeping in a different room. The only evidence they had was a single plate left in the sink, still wet, and a cup on the counter with fingerprints that didn't match either of the Hanleys. The idea that someone had been in there that whole time, right next to us, made me sick. We started thinking about all the nights we'd walked past that house coming back from class, the times we'd heard creaks or faint noises through the wall, and just ignored them. My roommate said he'd once seen a shape in the upstairs window a week before the screams, a silhouette that didn't move, just stood there for a long time. He'd assumed it was one of the Hanleys. After the police left, the house sat empty. They boarded up the windows for a while, but eventually the boards came down, and a property management company took over. No one ever said if they found the person who had been there. We checked the news for weeks waiting for an update, but there was nothing. The case went quiet. Over time, I started piecing things together in my head, replaying details I'd ignored. A few nights before the screams, I'd noticed the smell. A sour, decaying odor that drifted through the fence when the wind blew the right way. I thought it was trash. One morning I found our trash can lid open and some food wrappers scattered, like someone had rummaged through it. I blamed raccoons. Now, thinking back, it made sense that someone desperate could have been living there, sneaking out late, hiding during the day. I stopped sleeping well after that. Every creak in our house felt like footsteps. Every time the heater clicked on, I'd jolt awake, convinced someone was in the next room. For weeks I avoided looking at their windows at night. There was something about knowing that for nearly a month, a stranger had been just a few feet away from us, living quietly beside two bodies, pretending everything was normal. When the landlord came by to fix a broken pipe in our kitchen, he mentioned the Hanleys had no family nearby. He said the police believed whoever was living there had probably broken in after the couple died, using the house as shelter. A drifter maybe, someone passing through. They never found him, but they said he might have been the one we heard that night. The screams, maybe his own, or maybe something went wrong when he realized the police were coming. No one knew for sure. We moved out that winter. I told myself it was because of the heating bills, but really, I just couldn't stay. The memory of that night, that sound through the wall, still sticks with me. Sometimes even now. I think about how close we were. Two college kids sitting next door, living our lives, while something unthinkable was happening just a few feet away. I still don't know who was in that house, or what made them scream. The police never released the details, and after the story faded from the news, no one brought it up again. But whenever I drive past old neighborhoods and see dark windows and drawn blinds, I think about the Hanleys, about how easily a house can look ordinary from the outside while something rotten grows inside. I think about how close you can be to something terrible without realizing it until it's too late. And I always wonder if whoever lived in that house for those few silent weeks ever moved on, or if they're out there somewhere, finding another quiet home with the blinds drawn and the lights off, waiting for someone not to notice again. The guy who moved in next door to my girlfriend and me was strange from the start. We lived in a small 2-bedroom apartment complex on the edge of town, tucked behind an old gas station and a row of half-empty storage units. The kind of place that was cheap enough for young couples, quiet enough that no one really talked much. The units all looked the same: white vinyl siding, narrow porches, and one dim streetlight that barely reached the far end of the lot. He moved in on a Thursday afternoon in late September. I remember because I got home from work and saw him standing by his car with the trunk open, just staring at the building for a long time before carrying anything inside. No moving truck, no friends, not even much furniture. Just a couple of boxes, a rolled-up mattress, and a lamp. He was young, maybe mid-20s, pale with short hair and dark circles under his eyes. When he saw me, he gave this half-smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I nodded, said hey, but he didn't respond. Just went inside, leaving the door cracked open. At first, we didn't think much of it. People keep to themselves in places like that. But over the next few weeks, he started showing up a lot. Always quiet, always uncomfortably close. He'd knock at random times. Sometimes in the middle of dinner, sometimes late at night. He never asked for much, just odd things. Sugar one day, tape the next, a phone charger, a flashlight. Always something small, always with that same blank smile. My girlfriend started getting uneasy around him. She said he had this habit of looking at her a second too long, or standing too close in the hallway. I'd brushed it off at first, thinking maybe he was just socially awkward, lonely maybe. But it started to wear on both of us. We'd come home from work and sometimes see him sitting on his porch doing nothing. No phone, no book, no cigarette, just sitting and watching. If we went inside, he'd glance up, follow us with his eyes until the door shut. Then came the night that changed everything. It was just after 3 in the morning. We'd been asleep for hours when I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. The sound carried through the apartment, dull and heavy, like someone knocking with the side of their fist. My girlfriend woke up first, whispering that someone was at the door. I grabbed my phone, checked the time, and walked to the front. The hallway light was off, and only the glow from the digital clock lit the living room. I looked through the peephole, and there he was, standing inches from the door, facing straight ahead. His head was slightly tilted, like he was trying to listen for something inside. And then I noticed he was smiling. Not a friendly smile, not even nervous. Just that blank, steady grin, his eyes open too wide. I didn't open the door. I didn't even say anything at first. I just stood there, staring through the peephole, trying to make sense of it. He didn't move. He just stood there, still as a statue, the corners of his mouth stretched tight. I finally asked what he was doing, my voice low but steady. He didn't blink, didn't shift. He only spoke after several seconds, his voice calm and flat, like he was reading from a script. He said he just wanted to make sure we were safe. Then he turned and walked away, slow and steady until I couldn't hear his steps anymore. I stood there for a while after that, heart pounding, trying to figure out what to do. My girlfriend was standing behind me, whispering that we should call someone, but I said we'd talk to the landlord in the morning. When I went outside at sunrise to leave for work, I noticed something that froze me. Muddy footprints, clear and deep, right under our bedroom window. They led from the small patch of grass beside his porch, straight to our window, then back again. The glass was smudged, like someone had leaned against it. The footprints were fresh, darker than the rest of the dirt from last night's rain. That was when I decided to buy a small security camera. Nothing fancy, just one of those cheap Wi-Fi cameras that connect to your phone. I mounted it on the porch railing, angled toward the front door. My girlfriend thought it was overkill, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The next night, I barely slept. Around midnight, I kept checking the live feed on my phone, watching the grainy black and white image of our porch. For a long time, nothing happened. Then around 1:40 a.m., movement. A faint shape appeared at the edge of the frame. He walked into view slowly, wearing the same dark hoodie he always wore outside. He stopped right in front of the door, barely 2 feet away from the camera. He didn't knock this time. He didn't move at all. He just stood there facing the door, hands at his sides. For 30 minutes straight, he didn't do anything. No phone, no shifting, no noise. Just standing there. I didn't notice the footage until the next morning. When I checked the recording, my stomach dropped. The timestamp showed he'd been there from 1:43 a.m. to 2:15 a.m. The camera caught his face perfectly, expressionless, staring right into the lens, as if he knew it was there. I showed the footage to my girlfriend, and she started crying. She said she couldn't stay there anymore. I called the landlord that morning. He sounded surprised, said he'd go check the guy's unit right away. A few hours later, he called me back, his voice shaky. He said the apartment was empty. The guy was gone. No note, no boxes, no clothes. His car was still in the parking lot, but the place looked untouched, like he'd walked out and never planned on coming back. The landlord said he didn't even take his furniture, just the bare walls and an unmade bed. We didn't know what to make of it. Days went by and the car stayed parked there. Eventually a tow truck came and took it. The landlord said he filed a report, but nothing ever came of it. The guy's name wasn't even on the lease records the way it should have been. Just a partial application that had never been fully processed. It was like he'd slipped through the cracks somehow. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still around. I'd catch myself looking over my shoulder when taking out the trash or walking to my car before sunrise. Sometimes I'd wake up in the middle of the night convinced I heard footsteps on the porch, but the camera would show nothing. Eventually, the landlord rented the place out to someone else, a woman with 2 kids, and life started to feel normal again. But I still have the footage from that night saved on my phone. Every once in a while I open it and watch. The camera caught something else near the end, something I didn't notice until months later. At 2:14 a.m., right before the man turned to leave, he moved closer to the camera. His face filled the frame. For a few seconds, he just stared straight into the lens, eyes wide open. Then right before he stepped out of view, his lips moved. No sound, just a silent motion of his mouth forming one short phrase. I slowed it down, watched it over and over until I could read it. 4 words clear as day. He mouthed, "See you next time," and then he was gone. We never saw him again. But some nights, especially when the wind hits the windows just right, I still wake up and think I hear that same slow, deliberate knocking. 3 times, always 3. And for a moment I lie there listening, too afraid to move, too afraid to look at the door.